From New York, this is Democracy Now!
وأدعو الأمم المتحدة وجميع الهيئات.
I call on the United Nations, all international agencies, the international community, and worldwide public opinion to help save the Lebanese people from dying and prevent the demise of Lebanon. Lebanon is a few days away from the social explosion. The Lebanese are facing this dark fate alone.
Lebanon's caretaker prime minister warns the country could face a social explosion as Lebanon confronts what the World Bank has described as one of the worst economic depressions in modern history. We'll go to Beirut for the latest. Plus, we speak to a women's rights activist in the southern African nation of Eswatini, where the king is cracking down on the largest protest since the country, once known as Swaziland, became independent from Britain 53 years ago.
We have seen recordings.
We have seen recordings where police and the military were literally beating, shooting, killing unarmed civilians, unarmed Emaswatis, on the street. As I speak now, there are currently more than 50 people who have died, and within those victims, the youngest is 14 years old.
Plus, we get the latest on the fight over voting rights as Republicans in Texas unveil a host of new voter suppression measures during a special session. And President Biden and Vice President Harris take on voter suppression issues in Washington. Stay with us. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Joe Biden says the U.S. military will complete its withdrawal from Afghanistan by August 31st, nearly 2 weeks ahead of the previous September 11th deadline. Speaking from the White House Thursday, Biden said it would be up to Afghans to determine their own future nearly 2 decades after the U.S.-led invasion and occupation.
We did not go to Afghanistan to nation build, and it's the right and the responsibility of the Afghan people alone to decide their future and how they want to run their country. I will not send another generation of Americans to war in Afghanistan with no reasonable expectation of achieving a different outcome.
A Taliban delegation in Moscow said Friday the group now controls over 85% of Afghan territory. The Taliban has surrounded population centers, captured a key Afghan border crossing with Iran, and holds more than 2/3 of Afghanistan's border with Tajikistan. In Haiti, 2 Haitian Americans are among 17 suspects arrested over Wednesday's assassination of President Jovenel Moïse. Haitian authorities said a team of 28 heavily armed assailants, 26 of whom were Colombian, carried out the operation. They said at least 3 suspects were killed and 8 remain at large. Colombia's defense minister confirms some of the men are former members of Colombia's military. One of the 2 U.S. citizens arrested in Haiti is Haitian-American James Solage, the head of a maintenance and repair company in Florida. Little is known about the second Haitian-American suspect, Joseph Vincent, from the Miami area. The World Health Organization says Africa suffered its worst week since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, with cases of the Delta coronavirus variant surging in countries where almost no one has had access to vaccines. In Namibia, 9 senior government officials have died of COVID-19 over the last 2 weeks as hospitals have been overrun by new cases. Namibia now has one of the world's highest infection rates. Tunisia's healthcare system is collapsing as the North African nation logs nearly 10,000 positive tests a day. Coronavirus cases are rising again in the United States, led by clusters in areas with low vaccination rates. White House coronavirus response coordinator Jeff Zients on Thursday urged people to get vaccinated to stop the spread of the Delta coronavirus variant.
Virtually all COVID-19 hospitalizations and deaths in the United States are now occurring among unvaccinated individuals. And to be clear, there will likely continue to be an increase in cases among unvaccinated Americans and in communities with low vaccination rates, particularly given the spread of the more transmissible Delta variant.
Pfizer said Thursday it's tweaking its COVID-19 vaccine formula to create a shot that targets the Delta variant. Pfizer's also planning to request emergency authorization in the United States next month for a booster shot of its vaccine, saying an early study showed a third dose raised neutralizing antibody levels in patients. On Thursday, the Centers for Disease Control and the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, issued a rare joint statement saying they won't rely exclusively on drug company data to make a decision on booster shots. Texas Republicans are doubling down in their efforts to suppress voting rights as they unveiled a host of new restrictive measures during a special session Thursday. The bills include a ban on drive-through voting and 24-hour or late-night voting options. They would penalize election officials who make voting easier by sending out unsolicited absentee applications. The measures would also impose stringent signature matching requirements and increase the power of partisan poll observers, which can result in intimidation. The new restrictions, which disproportionately target voters of color, come after Texas Democratic lawmakers staged a walkout in late May to block the Republican-controlled legislature from passing a sweeping voter suppression bill. We'll have more on this story after headlines. 15 states have agreed to abandon their fight to block the bankruptcy plan of Purdue Pharma, the maker of the highly addictive OxyContin. In exchange, Purdue will release tens of millions of documents, pay a settlement expected to reach $4.5 billion, and the Sackler family will agree to cede ownership of Purdue. The deal, which includes the states of New York and Massachusetts, would shield the Sacklers from future opioid lawsuits. The Sackler family will not have to apologize or admit responsibility for their role in fueling the opioid epidemic, which has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. 9 other states and Washington, D.C. still oppose this week's agreement and are expected to keep fighting the Sackler bankruptcy plan. President Biden met with top cybersecurity advisors this week as the White House vowed to address mounting cyber attacks with Russian officials. Bloomberg reports Russian government hackers are behind a breach of a Republican National Committee contractor last week, though the source of the cyber attack has not been confirmed. The breach happened around the same time a massive global ransomware attack compromised hundreds of businesses and localities in the U.S. and around the world. Russia's denied responsibility for the hacks. In Bangladesh, at least 52 people have been killed after a massive fire broke out at a food processing factory outside the capital Dhaka Thursday. Many workers jumped from the factory's upper floors as the inferno blazed throughout the night and into the next day. It's unclear how many people remain trapped inside. The cause of the fire is not yet known, but such disasters are not uncommon due to poor or unheeded safety regulations in factories and residential buildings. Spanish police have arrested 3 suspects connected to the beating death of a young gay man whose killing set off massive protests in Madrid, Barcelona, and other cities throughout Spain. 24-year-old nursing assistant Samuel Luis died after he was beaten near a nightclub early Saturday in a town in northern Spain. One of his attackers was heard shouting a homophobic slur. The killing brought tens of thousands of demonstrators into the streets less than a week after Spain's annual Pride celebrations.
The country still does not really accept that there are many different ways to love. It should not be possible that, just because a person decides to live his life loving a person of the same gender, or loving whomever, he ends up losing his life.
The European Parliament voted Thursday to suspend funding to Hungary over its new law banning the depiction of homosexuality to children, saying it violates EU values, principles, and law. The vote came one day after the law equating homosexuality with pedophilia went into effect. In the occupied West Bank, Israeli forces have destroyed homes in a Palestinian Bedouin community for the 7th time since November, claiming they were built without permits. A Palestinian Authority official said Wednesday's demolition left dozens of people homeless, including 35 children.
This is evidence that the occupation state is carrying out state-sponsored terrorism against the Palestinian existence. Now 63 Palestinians have become homeless. 11 families had their homes demolished and confiscated, even water tanks that a Palestinian citizen uses to provide water for their family and their livestock. They were confiscated and destroyed by the occupation.
Elsewhere in the occupied West Bank, Israel's military blew up the family home of a Palestinian-American man accused of killing an Israeli teenager. Thursday's explosions leveled the home of Sana Shalabi, who says her estranged husband rarely visited the property. Israel's home demolition drew a rare rebuke from the State Department, which said Secretary of State Antony Blinken raised the issue with senior Israeli officials. Human rights groups have condemned Israel's punitive home demolitions as collective punishment and a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. El Salvador's government has expelled prominent Mexican journalist Daniel Lizarraga after he led investigations into government corruption at the Salvadoran online news source El Faro. In a video message recorded at the airport just before his expulsion to Mexico, Lizarraga promised El Faro would remain committed to independent journalism.
They will not silence us. It won't happen. We won't stop publishing. We'll continue offering the best information possible to the best of our abilities, as rigorously as possible.
The Inter-American Press Association and other press freedom groups have condemned the government of President Nayib Bukele for clamping down on dissent. A new analysis by the World Weather Attribution Network finds this summer's record-shattering heat wave in the Pacific Northwest would have been, quote, virtually impossible without human-caused climate change. The study also warned that as the human-induced climate crisis continues to heat the planet, such events will become a lot less rare. The high temperature in Lytton, British Columbia, hit 121 degrees Fahrenheit June 29th, one day before a massive wildfire destroyed most of the town. The heat wave is blamed for up to 500 deaths in British Columbia, 78 deaths in Washington state, and 116 deaths in Oregon. California's governor has asked state residents to reduce their water use as he expands a drought emergency declaration to areas home to nearly half of California's population. Governor Gavin Newsom made the announcement Thursday at Lopez Lake, a reservoir in San Luis Obispo County that's at just 34% capacity.
The hots are getting a lot hotter, the dries are getting a lot drier, and climate change is real, and it's here. And if you don't believe it, because you don't believe science, you got to believe your own eyes. California just experienced its driest rainy season on record, with average statewide precipitation plummeting to a 126-year low. And 14-year-old Zaila Avantgarde has become the first African-American winner of the Scripps National Spelling Bee.
Murraya, Murraya.
That is correct.
The New Orleans teen is also a basketball prodigy and holds 3 Guinness World Records in dribbling. Zaila Avantgarde entered the world of competitive spelling just 2 years ago. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Biden met with civil rights groups Thursday to discuss ways to combat voter suppression efforts, as the White House announced a new effort to counter the Republican push to pass voting restrictions in key battleground states. Vice President Kamala Harris also announced that the Democratic National Committee would be spending an additional $25 million on organizing and registration efforts. She spoke at Howard University.
We are going to assemble the largest voter protection team we have ever had to ensure that all Americans can vote and have your vote counted in a fair and transparent process.
Meanwhile, in Texas, lawmakers followed other battleground states controlled by Republicans with a new push Thursday to overhaul the state's election laws. In a special session called by the governor, they introduced bills based on their earlier attempt to pass a sweeping voting bill that failed in the last session after Democrats walked out. For more, we're joined by Cliff Albright, co-founder and executive director of Black Voters Matter, which recently finished a 9-state, 10-day freedom ride to mark the 60th anniversary of the first freedom rides for voting rights. Cliff, we welcome you back to Democracy Now! Can you talk about, we'll start with Texas and then go national. What is happening in Texas right now with this special session?
Right. So there's a special session. We're calling it the suppression session because in addition to pulling out this voter suppression bill, which in a state that's already has one of the lowest turnout rates in the country, where it's already the hardest to vote, they would make it even more difficult by passing a bunch of draconian legislation pieces of provisions that would include criminalizing not just voters or people that try to provide assistance to voters, even criminalizing election officials that send out absentee ballot applications to voters. But one of the worst provisions in this bill is the one, and we talked a lot about this a couple of months ago when they were first trying to pass it, they still have the provision that would allow election observers, partisan election observers, basically unfettered access to the polling places, including the possibility of video recording voters. We already know that Republicans had been using this as a recruitment tactic. They said that they wanted to recruit an army of thousands that would flood the polling places to observe voters, the kind of army of observers that Trump talked about during his campaign. And so this is just again, one of the worst bills. This would make it the worst voter suppression bill in the country. And I will add this. It's a suppression session, not just because of this bill that they're considering, the voter suppression bill, but also because this special session, this suppression session, includes 11 other bills that are basically a smorgasbord of white supremacy, patriarchy, transphobia, just everything that you can imagine that is the worst on the Republican agenda. They've included in this suppression session, which is a reminder that when they suppress our votes, black and brown votes in particular, but all votes, when they suppress our votes, when they distort this democracy or what's left of it, it has implications that affect a range of policies dealing with our health, our economics. They've even got critical race theory in this suppression session.
And talk about how this is being repeated around the country in what other states. And will the Texas Democrats walk out?
Right. So first, I'll deal with the second half of that in terms of the Texas Democrats walking out. I mean, they've said in interviews, and they said yesterday at the press conference at the rally that we helped to organize, that everything is on the table. But I think that they really gave us a blueprint that Democrats in other states really need to look at. You know, I've been saying, we talk a lot about civil disobedience. What we need right now, along with civil disobedience on the streets, is legislative disobedience. If Republicans are going to change rules in all of these states where they're trying to push this suppression through, and there's still bills pending in I think at least a dozen other states, including Michigan and Pennsylvania. But if they're going to play around with the rules and suspend rules and change the rules of the game in order to push the suppression through, Democrats all across this country need to be willing to follow the pattern that the Texas Democrats demonstrated after weeks and months of grassroots organizing by an incredible coalition, Texas Right to Vote Coalition in Texas. The legislators were then able to finally do the walkout. That needs to be a blueprint all across this country. I will add this. It was disappointing that with this massive press conference that took place yesterday that included grassroots organizations as well as Texas Democrats from the state house, that there was no federal presence. Like Kamala Harris could have been there. Since she's the czar on this, Joe Biden could have been there. Somebody from the Justice Department could have been there. Somebody from the Democratic National Committee could have been there. Any number of federal folks to demonstrate that Texas is not alone and that no state is alone in this battle. That would have been a good thing to show. But again, the Texas legislators and the grassroots organizations were there taking a stand on their own. We'll continue to do that in state after state. But this is a federal battle that's going to require federal legislation.
Well, you came out quite strongly in a series of tweets yesterday, Cliff. Among them, don't come relying on activists to out-organize voter suppression to compensate for your legislative failures. This ain't the Green Mile or Bagger Vance, and we are not your magical Negroes covering up your mediocrity, lukewarm support, and broken promises. And then you name POTUS, Senator Schumer, and VP. Talk about what you feel they're not only not doing in Texas, but why you feel this must be done at a national level. When the For the People Act was being considered in Congress that week, President Biden did not speak on it. He gave a major address on crime instead.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, and you know, to speak to the tweet, there's a feeling, and it's come out, you know, both in the actions coming from the White House as well as in some, you know, leaked, unnamed staffers, that basically they feel like organizers will be able to out-organize the voter suppression, that we'll be able to out-organize Jim Crow, or even to out-litigate this Jim Crow, which, again, cannot happen without federal legislation. Sherrilyn Ifill from the Legal Defense Fund tweeted as much out yesterday as well, that we cannot out-litigate this if we don't have the federal protections necessary in the form of the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. If we don't have those protections necessary, you can't out-litigate it, you can't out-organize it, and it's unfair and actually insulting for the White House to assume, or for the party to put that burden on the backs of voters, again, primarily black voters and brown voters and marginalized voters, to put that burden on our backs because they fail to get past this necessary piece of legislation. What could the administration do more of? Just a couple of months ago, Joe Biden said in an interview that he was at least open to modifying the filibuster, but we haven't heard anything else about that. Just like he presented a plan, he didn't just leave it up to Congress to say what he wanted on infrastructure, right? They had a White House plan for infrastructure. They had a White House plan on American families and American jobs. Where is your plan on voting rights? Where is your plan? If you're open, don't just be open to modifying the filibuster. Show Joe Manchin what your plan is and tell him, Joe, we've known each other for decades. I need you to get this rules change on the filibuster. Chuck Schumer, have a specific plan to get the filibuster at least modified. I'd really like to see it ended, but at least to get it modified. He has not shown the same level of aggression that he has shown, and urgency that he's shown on other issues. On this voting rights issue, we need him to use the bully pulpit. We need him to use every carrot, every stick, and show Joe Manchin a specific plan and twist those arms the same way Lyndon B. Johnson did, because he was forced to by organizers. But he needs to have that kind of a moment instead of a Rutherford B. Hayes moment, who was the president who ended Reconstruction, took the federal troops out of the South, and basically allowed white Southerners to have their way with black folks all across the country. We don't need Joe Biden to have that moment and to follow that example. We need him to follow a more aggressive example that supports and aggressively fights for voting rights.
Well, let's hear what they did say at the White House yesterday. President Biden and Vice President Harris meeting with civil rights leaders. This is Sherrilyn Ifill of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund speaking to the Black News Channel after the meeting.
I used the opportunity to talk about the history of civil rights legislation in this country, of the Supreme Court's role in often eroding civil rights statutes, dating back to the 19th century, dating back to the 1875 Civil Rights Act and the civil rights cases, dating back to Plessy versus Ferguson, dating back to Mobile versus Bolden, the voting rights case in 1980 that Congress had to overturn in 1982 with the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. And then, of course, Shelby County versus Holder and last week's decision in the Brnovich case. We are at, again, such a moment. We are litigating at the Legal Defense Fund in Georgia, challenging their voter suppression law. We're challenging Florida's voter suppression law. But I told the president we will not be able to litigate our way out of this threat to black citizenship, voting, and political participation.
So that's Sherrilyn Ifill of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And Vice President Harris announced a $25 million DNC investment to aid voting access ahead of the 2022 midterm elections. Cliff Albright, you are talking to us from Atlanta, and the 2022 is very important. Both Senate seats were taken by Democrats, which has clearly been a great motivation not only in Georgia for the Republicans, but around the country to get rid of voters on voting rolls, certainly in Georgia. If you can talk about what has happened there, Reverend Raphael Warnock is up again in 2022. But what that DNC influx of money means, is it what you're calling the fierce urgency of now that has been lacking from the federal government?
Unfortunately, no, that's not the fierce urgency of now. $25 million, it sounds like a lot, like certainly in my personal life, that would be a lot. But, you know, in terms of democracy, that's a drop in the bucket. Let me say this, since you played the clip from Sherrilyn Ifill, and we're talking about what can the White House do. It would be a good time to seriously discuss expanding the court, and I would love to see somebody like Sherrilyn Ifill as being somebody nominated to an expanded Supreme Court. That's going to be necessary because even if they pass the legislation, it's still going to have to pass the constitutionality test from a Supreme Court that has already shown what its predilections are or what its taste is. And so we need to expand the court. But again, you asked about Georgia. Yes, Senator Warnock is going to be up again next year. And as we've said, we are not going to be able to just out-organize this level of voter suppression. And even if we do, the scary thing about the Georgia bill, which is part of a trend that we're seeing in other states, is that it's got that piece in there that would make it easier for the state to overturn elections. They've already gone about the process of removing officials from some of the election boards in some of the counties. That was made possible by this new law. And with that provision, even if we out-organize the suppression and win the votes, they can always come back and do exactly what Donald Trump was trying to get the Secretary of State to do on that phone call, which is to go out and find 11,000 votes, or go out and decide that Fulton County, predominantly black county in Georgia, that county's vote shouldn't be counted. This bill would give them the ability to do that. So we can't out-organize the level of Jim Crow suppression that we're seeing. We have got to have federal protections. We'll do everything that we can, but we need help from the federal government. The $25 million, there are organizations, we came close to spending that much in just our limited footprint across the country to mobilize voters. $25 million is not nearly enough to combat the kind of voter suppression that we're seeing. And beyond the amount, last thing I'll say, beyond the amount is just the timing or the sequencing. Now is not the time to be talking about how we're going to try to mitigate the impact of voter suppression. If the DNC is going to spend $25 million, I'd rather they spend it supporting groups that are organizing to fight the suppression. Let's finish this fight before we start talking about how we're going to mitigate the suppression that we're basically conceding we're going to fail on defeating.
And finally, Cliff Albright, talk about the 60th anniversary of the Freedom Rides and the Freedom Rides that you engaged in. You're again speaking to us from Atlanta. John Lewis, the late, great John Lewis, participated in those first Freedom Rides 60 years ago.
Yeah, it was just an incredible experience for us. The Freedom Ride for voting rights, marking the 60th anniversary. We wanted to do a reverse Freedom Ride where we went, instead of going from D.C. to the South, like in 1961, we took it from the South all the way up to D.C. We passed through 9 states, or 10 states if you include the state of D.C., because part of our objectives with the Freedom Ride was to talk about 3 pieces of legislation: the H.R. 1, S1, of course, the For the People Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and H.R. 51, which is an issue a lot of people in the country don't know enough about, which is D.C. statehood. The denial of the vote to D.C. is one of the oldest forms of voter suppression. And so our rally that took place on the 26th was largely about D.C. statehood, as well as the other 2 pieces of voting rights legislation. But we stopped in 9 states along the way, even more cities, because we did some pit stops throughout. And at each location, we were doing rallies, educating voters about the legislation, motivating voters to get involved in how to fight for this legislation, and to talk about the history of the 1961 Freedom Rides, because that's history that a lot of people don't know a lot about. We think that, there was slavery, and then all of a sudden Dr. King gave a speech in 1963, and then Barack Obama was president. And in spite of what you hear about critical race theory, there's a lot of our history that's not taught. Those freedom rides were an important part of that civil rights movement, and part of why we wanted to focus on it is because we believe that by raising that history and amplifying it, and by featuring actual freedom riders at some of the stops, some of the rallies, we had actual freedom riders from 1961 who told their stories. By amplifying that history, you can't help but hear that history and not get involved in today's movement, to hear how those freedom riders saw a bus get bombed and then they decided not to run away from the movement, but to actually run to the bombing and to finish the freedom rides. You can't hear that history and not ask yourself, will I answer the call today? So it was an incredible experience. We had dozens of national organizations that joined us, including many of those organizations that met with President Biden yesterday.
Well, we want to thank you very much, Cliff Albright, for joining us, co-founder and executive director of Black Voters Matter, speaking to us from Atlanta, Georgia. Coming up, we'll speak to a women's rights activist in the southern African nation of Eswatini, where the king's cracking out on dissent. This is the country formerly known as Swaziland. Stay with us.
One day you'll make it. Before you lose yourself, don't forget to dream. You're a star so high, your future is going higher, going higher. Didn't even fall, it's a good chance, yeah. And you go, and you go, and you go, go as you go.
Salt. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn to the African nation of Eswatini, which was known as Swaziland up until 2018. Eswatini is a landlocked nation in southern Africa. It's bordered by Mozambique to its northeast and by South Africa in all other directions. It's also Africa's last absolute monarchy. Human rights advocates are denouncing Eswatini's king, Mswati III, for brutally cracking down on the largest protests in the country since it became independent from Britain 53 years ago. Eswatini is currently facing an economic crisis with a shortage of gas, food, and other resources. More than half of Eswatini's more than 1 million citizens live in poverty, while King Mswati is known for his lavish lifestyle, including owning expensive cars and palaces. Amnesty International reported at least 20 protesters have been killed by state security forces and dozens of others tortured, detained, or abducted. There have also been reports of the military and police firing live rounds at protesters. The Committee to Protect Journalists has also criticized the government for mistreatment of journalists and for cutting off internet access. According to CPJ, 2 journalists from South Africa were recently detained and beaten while in custody. Well, on Tuesday, Democracy Now!'s Juan Gonzalez and I spoke to a women's rights activist in Manzini, Eswatini. She asked us not to show her face and to disguise her voice because she's concerned she would be attacked for doing this interview. She began by talking about what sparked the recent protests.
In March
2021, a university law student called Tabane Kamonye, who was a final year student, was alleged to have been killed by the police. Because of the ongoing police brutality before the death of Tabane Kamonye, I would like to highlight some of the instances which made Mswati, or the Swazi people, feel this is enough. We can't take it anymore. First of all, Eswatini is facing a serious economic crisis, where we have a high level of poverty and an unemployment crisis. We are also facing issues of students not getting quality education. And also, those who would want to go to universities, there are no scholarships because the government is saying they can't afford them. We are also facing challenges, a health crisis, where you go to clinics and you don't find medication, where As a woman, you want to go to the clinic, you have to walk kilometers and kilometers to get to the nearest clinic where you can get help. We are facing all those challenges, which include extrajudicial killings, where fellow civilians or citizens, when they pass by game reserves, the rangers, they shoot to kill, and nothing. It's like they have killed something that doesn't matter. It's not a human being. We are seeing an increase of police brutality, which not only happened to Tabane Kamonye. We have seen cases where people are demonstrating. There was a live recording which was circulating on social media of a group of police officers beating an unarmed man who was part of a protest of transport operators and insulting him, which really triggered the people of Eswatini. And nothing was done to those police officers. And more than that, we have seen in Eswatini, we are experiencing an increase of cases of violence against women. And some of these women have died, killed by enforcement officers who are maybe their husbands or lovers. And it has made Emaswatis lose trust in the justice system because we have seen some of these women abused and nothing happened. Instead, the law enforcement officers are promoted if they've abused a woman.
I'd like to ask our guest, could you mentioned the economic crisis that the country is going through. The country is a landlocked nation surrounded on three sides by South Africa, on one side by Mozambique. What has been, and many of the people of your country work in South Africa. Could you talk about what the South African government's response has been to this repression, if any?
Some of the Emaswati have been moving out now to try and look for work in South Africa. And we have now experienced some of the Emaswati being killed, attacked by South Africans, because the South Africans felt the Swazi people are going out to take their jobs. And it has become a very difficult situation. And this is why, even now, we are pleading with our fellow Africans and also the international community to say, what is it that we can do to try and address this situation without having lives lost? Let me also highlight another issue which has really infuriated Emaswatis. Whilst I have mentioned that Swaziland is facing economic crisis, there was a debate in Parliament where Parliament was supposed to endorse a loan by our government to borrow money from India to build a new parliament. As I've said, political parties were banned in Eswatini. So our members of parliament, when they go to parliament, for them to be respected or to be heard by the head of the country, they have to listen. If they ask you to jump, you ask how high. You jump on the tune of what the head of the country is saying. So people were saying, how can a whole country borrow money to build a new parliament when we have been hit hard by COVID-19? We have not been vaccinated. We do not have funds to get the vaccine. How can we build a new parliament instead of maybe using those funds to procure ventilators or to procure medicines that we don't have, or to beef up the health and education systems so that we have a quality health system and a quality education system? So when Tabane Kamonye was murdered, the youth and everyone felt this is enough. And that's when there was a first march where the youth, it was the first march in history to have Emaswati gathered in that form. And when these youth were demonstrating, going to the police station around where the student who was alleged to be murdered by the police, instead of government or parliament taking action or doing an investigation, they condemned those young people for doing that. And they were told if they've got issues, they have got to go to their constituencies where they can raise their grievances. Hence, the protests that were all over the country. So All the young people in civil society organizations, they went to the different constituencies, and now people were putting clear demands. They wanted multi-party democracy. They wanted an elected prime minister. They were asking and demanding improved youth employment strategies. They wanted an improved health system. They are also calling for gender-based violence to be declared as a national emergency. Those are some of the many demands that were raised in the different constituencies to the different members of parliament.
And let me ask you about the internet blackouts being condemned by human rights groups, just the shutting down, working with international companies to just shut down the ability to communicate.
Yeah. Let me first talk about before the shutting down, because the people were sending protests in their constituencies, exercising their constitutional rights. The Prime Minister, the acting Prime Minister, Themba Masuku, issued an order to stop the delivery of petitions to the different constituencies. And by doing that, he said he is trying to stop the unrest. He also ordered all businesses to close by 3:30 p.m. and a strict curfew to have all residents off the street from 6 up until 5 a.m. And he also immediately closed all schools. He said it was for the safety of the learners. And he ordered the protesters to send their petitions online. And whilst he said they must send their petitions online, they then ordered the internet service provider to switch off the internet. And then Emaswatis were so furious, saying, "Then what do you mean?" And whilst they have done that, they then unleashed the army, the police, and the military to attack people who were looting on the streets. And some were burning structures, were burning shops, were burning vehicles on the streets. As I have mentioned, Swaziland is facing a serious poverty crisis. And when people are angry, there is a lot that can happen. We have seen recordings where police and the military were literally beating, shooting, killing unarmed civilians, unarmed Emaswatis, on the street. As I speak now, there are currently more than 50 people who have died. And within those victims, the youngest is 14 years old.
We are not identifying you, but you are a women's rights activist in Eswatini. What is the current situation for women under crackdown right now?
The current situation is very bad. It has hit women hard. And in Eswatini, 70% of the population is living in the rural areas. And in the rural areas, there are few shops. And those few shops have been burned. They have been looted. And now it is difficult for women to get food to eat. It is difficult to get sanitary pads for their kids, to buy milk for their babies. It's a very painful situation. And some of the people that have been arrested for looting, they are women. And as we speak, they have been denied bail just for looting. There is also a heavily pregnant woman who was denied bail yesterday. And we are worried about the safety of these women. And now the army. What do? They go to each and every home and say, "Where did you buy this sugar? Where did you buy this cooking oil?" If you don't have receipts, and these are rural areas, they don't have them, they are beaten. Some of these women are beaten, and when they explain, "I don't have a receipt, I bought in the nearby shop," and no one listens to that. So women are hit hard, and some of the dead people have left behind kids, which means women now have a heavy load to take care of those kids. And the shops that were burned, people have lost jobs. And the majority of people who work in the shops or restaurants are women, which means now they are without jobs. Their situation is very bad. We are worried now that, yes, we've been facing the scourge of gender-based violence, but this situation will exacerbate. This is a situation where we will see more women abused, more women staying in abusive relationships or abusive marriages.
That was a women's rights activist speaking to us from Eswatini, the country formerly known as Swaziland. She asked us not to show her face, to disguise her voice, because she was concerned she would be attacked for doing this interview. When we come back, Lebanon's caretaker prime minister warns the country could face a social explosion as Lebanon confronts what the World Bank has described as one of the worst economic depressions in modern history. We'll go to Beirut. Stay with us. Dreams of the Imagination by Sandy Shamoun. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. Lebanon's caretaker prime minister is warning the country is days away from a social explosion as the country confronts what the World Bank has described as one of the worst economic depressions in modern history. Prime Minister Hassan Diab made the comment in a meeting with ambassadors earlier this week in Beirut.
I call on the United Nations, all international agencies, the international community, and worldwide public opinion to help save the Lebanese people from dying and prevent the demise of Lebanon. Lebanon is a few days away from the social explosion. The Lebanese are facing this dark fate alone.
The impact of Lebanon's economic crisis has been staggering. The country's currency has lost more than 90% of its value. Unemployment has skyrocketed. Fuel prices have soared. Most homes and businesses and even hospitals only have power for a few hours each day. Pharmacies are running low on medicine. The UN has warned over 3/4 of households in Lebanon don't have enough food or money to buy food. Lebanon is also facing a massive political crisis following the devastating explosion at the port of Beirut last August. The explosion killed over 200 people, injured 7,000, and left more than 250,000 Beirut residents homeless. Prime Minister Hassan Diab and his cabinet resigned after the blast, but Lebanese politicians have failed to form a new government, leaving Diab and his cabinet in power, but in a limited caretaker capacity. Joining us now from Beirut is Nisreen Salti, an economics professor at the American University of Beirut. We're also joined by Ziad Abu-Rish, the director of the MA program in Human Rights and the Arts at Bard College, also a board member of the Lebanese Studies Association and the co-editor of Jadaliyya-e-Zine. He's joining us from Seattle, Washington. Professor Nisreen Salti, let's begin with you. Explain the scope of what is happening in Lebanon right now.
So to understand the nature of the crisis, it's perhaps useful to go back a little bit in time to see what setup led to the conditions that led to collapse. What we have is an economic system that was set up in the mid-1990s after the Civil War, and that instituted macroeconomic policies that put in place all sorts of economic elements, almost structurally, in the system. So we ended up with an economy that is heavily reliant on imports for the bulk of its needs, for its consumption, and very low or discouraged local production. And with this combination of two structural factors led to an unhealthy dependence on foreign currency inflows, in particular dollar inflows. This setup privileged a very small class of business interests, namely import cartels and bank owners and real estate agents, real estate developers. And they were closely connected to a political class. And together, these two groups amassed enormous profits to the detriment of the local productive sector, of job creation, of diversification, And that gradually resulted in two things: growing inequality, income inequality, over almost 2.5 decades, which is one of the symptoms that was already heralding an impending collapse. And then also the conditions that today led to the crisis, which is that we became extremely dependent on these dollar inflows. And the minute the dollar inflows stopped, which is what happened in the fall of 2019 when the crisis started, the entire system crumbled. So what is the scope of this type of collapse? Well, as you described, the poverty rate has more than doubled in 18 months. We have seen rates of food insecurity that are unprecedented for the country. Unemployment has soared. The rate of migration of students from private to public schools because they can no longer afford private schools is ever growing. There's been a shortage of basic life essentials, fuel for electricity, for transport, but also medicines, baby formula. This is, after all, a crisis that the World Bank is describing now as one of the 3 worst in the last century and a half. So the economy has shrunk very, very rapidly. So the little that was left of the middle class before the crisis began is now being pushed into poverty because there are very few jobs, very few economic opportunities. Also because those that still have jobs have seen their incomes lose purchasing power daily because of the hyperinflation that the country is experiencing. And then finally, because the banking crisis has meant that savings for most of society have been decimated, again, because of the currency and banking crises. So we have a middle class and poorer classes that are choked from all the standard sources of livelihood, all the standard sources of incomes. Meanwhile, the business and political class that benefited from the system was able to plunder the economy for 20-odd years, 20-plus years, and now has safely stowed its wealth abroad, outside of the country, so safe from the collapse. And many actually even continue to profiteer from the downfall through classic predatory tactics like hoarding or smuggling or extortion. So yes, the crisis has made a very highly unequal society even more economically polarized today.
Ziad Abu-Rish, if you can also now put this in the context of the explosion that took place almost a year ago, last August. It seemed to have also exploded the government, but the government actually remains. Hassan Diab is still the acting prime minister. Can you talk about the judge investigating this huge explosion at the port of Beirut and now seeking to summon a range of powerful politicians and business people and could criminally charge them, and how that fits into this enormous economic crisis?
Absolutely, Amy. Well, for the listeners that might not be aware, the investigating judge, Tariq Bitar, recently submitted a formal request to lift immunity from those politicians that have immunity and to be able to bring them in for formal questioning and potentially file charges against them. This includes former ministers of finance, former ministers of interior, former ministers of public works, the former head of the army, the former head of military intelligence, as well as the current heads of general security and state security. These positions also reflect a diverse array of political parties across the kind of major divide in the Lebanese political system. But we are yet to see whether this immunity is going to be lifted and what possibilities might actually result from this initial attempt. We should remember also that
Ziad,
he replaced a previous judge who was removed from his position when he initiated such proceedings. So while there are important developments with this investigation, we need to see if they're going to hit the same dead ends as the previous judge did, or if they're going to move forward.
He's also seeking to question the acting prime minister?
Yes. It includes the current acting prime minister, Hassan Diab, who is in the caretaker government, as you suggested. I just want to point out, to link the Beirut port explosion of August 4th with the economic crisis that Dr. Salti so eloquently explained. Part of the problem is the total lack of accountability. We are almost 1 year from the first year anniversary. We are almost 1 month from the first year anniversary of the Beirut explosion, and there have been no major prosecutions yet, no major accountability. We are months and years now into this financial crisis, and as you quoted Hassan Diab initially at the beginning of this segment, he is pleading with the international community to come and save Lebanon, ignoring the fact that he and his allies and the entire political class in Lebanon are responsible for the economic collapse of Lebanon as much as they are responsible for the Beirut port explosion. And the very international community that he is begging literally to help save Lebanon aided and abetted this entire political class for the last 30 years in bringing Lebanon to this point with the Beirut port explosion and the financial crisis.
Given what has happened, Professor Nasreen Salti, in Beirut, it is surprising there isn't more protest in the street. I mean, the currency devalued at 90%, the enormous pressure on people. What do you think needs to happen right now?
Very difficult question. People, I think, have been bogged down by the impossibility of keeping their life together at a very daily, basic level, which may explain why there hasn't been massive protests, although you will see that there are flare-ups of protests here and there. People are quite destitute and are literally trying to find their livelihood in any way that they can. There's also been a history, maybe before the pandemic was at its height, of very violent repression of protests when they have taken place. So there is the wound also from that experience that people still carry today. What needs to happen, in my opinion, is it's clear that setting it up as a question of forming a new government and returning to the table of negotiations with the IMF, which is the way out, as cast often in mainstream media, is really not a way out, but a return to the status quo ante. In my opinion, what needs to happen is a deep overhaul of the current system. What needs to happen is a change in the very nature of the relationship between the state and its citizens, to transform it into a civil state that doesn't mediate its relationship to citizens through religious communities, a new vision for an economy that is productive rather than precarious and rentier, and captured by a small group of coalesced interests, and a state with some, at least minimal notion of social justice, which today our current reality completely eschews. So that, I think, is what really needs to happen in order to come out of this. Is there any chance of this? There are small signs of hope. There's, in the face of the impossibility of daily life that our current reality has become in the economic freefall, there are a few committed groups, vocal activists, and people on the ground who are organizing, who are coalescing around these very transformative goals.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with us. And, of course, we're going to continue to follow this closely. Nasreen Salti, economics professor at the American University of Beirut. We're going to link to your piece that you wrote back in 2019, No Country for Poor Men, How Lebanon Debt has exacerbated inequality. And Ziad Abu-Rish, I want to thank you for being with us, director of the MA program in Human Rights and the Arts at Bard College, also a board member of the Lebanese Studies Association and the co-editor of Jadaliyya e-zine. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Is produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Messiah Rhodes, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Tarasena, Tammy Warrenoff, Jarina Nadura, Sam Alkoff, Taymarie Astudio, John Hamilton, Rabi Karen, Hani Masood, and Adriana Contreras. Our general manager is Julie Crosby. Special thanks to Becca Stelly, Marian Barnard, Paul Power, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Hugh Grant, Dennis Moynihan. I'm Amy Goodman. This is Democracy Now!